Good morning and welcome to you all. I'm Robyn Alders. I'm a Senior Consulting Fellow with the Chatham House Global Health Program, which is a partner organisation with the Poultry Hub. This is the 14th panel in our Roadmap series, Discussions for the Future of Poultry, People and Planet. These fortnightly discussions address key issues for sustainable development from the perspective of nutrition security and the global poultry industry. We aim to contribute to the UN call that we build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic for the future we want. Before we get underway, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's discussion will last for 1 hour. The event is being recorded and will be available on the One Health Poultry Hub website, and a direct link will be sent to you, to all registered attendees. Do please put questions to the panel through the Zoom Q&A function, which you can access at the bottom of your screens. Feel free to vote for questions that you think particularly important. And if English is not your first language, please don't let this stop you from asking questions. I will put as many of your questions as possible to our panelists. If your question is covered in a previous answer or if we run out of time, please accept my apologies in advance. We have an online discussion channel that you can access from the website and from your registration link. Please explore this to share questions, comments, thoughts. These online discussions will contribute to a series of briefing notes that we will be preparing from this series. Today's discussion is on food systems, local, regional, or global. And our expert panelists are going to explore the crucial issues of whether it matters where our food comes from and what local cuisines and environments teach us about sustainability and food security. First, we'd welcome your thoughts on this topic via the first poll, which should be coming up onto your screens now. The poll will disappear from your screen once you vote. And in it, we're wondering that in our world, what do you think? Please choose the one option that best represents your views, and we'll come back and have a look at your answers in a few moments. I'm delighted to welcome our expert panelists for today. Dr Sagari Ramdas, a veterinary scientist at Food Sovereignty Alliance India and a former Anthra governing board member, and Professor Neil Burgess, Chief Scientist at the United Nations Environment Programme and Programme Lead for the GCRF Trade Development and Environment Hub. Welcome to both of you. You each have 10 minutes to present your thoughts, and we'll give you a signal at around 9 minutes to let you know that you've got 1 minute to wrap up. So with no further ado, over to you, Professor Burgess. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about global food systems down to local. I'm going to try to make links between some of the work that we have been doing and the poultry kind of issue, and also the COVID issue. First couple of slides are just a little bit about our hub, GCRF hub, which is about trade in agricultural commodities and trade in wild species, including wild meat trades. So next slide, please. And the hub is working in Brazil, the Congo countries, Gabon, Cameroon, Tanzania, China, and Indonesia on a variety of commodities. And there's a link to our website there if you want to find out more about what we're doing. Next slide, please. And we involve a lot of partners, including Chatham House as well. So, you know, mixture of NGOs, universities, think tanks in China, and other kind of organizations. So that's just a little bit of promotion for our hub. Next slide, please. One of the things that we're looking at is, you know, agricultural commodity supply chains. So, you know, soy, oil, palm, coffee, cocoa, a whole variety of commodity supply chains. Where do things get produced? In what ways? Where do they get traded to? And what are the impacts on people and nature, and the links to food security? Next slide, please. And this is just a single example of the global soybean trade, which is, you know, a major supplier of food sourced to other animals. So soybean is grown and is often fed to pigs and to chickens. So it's part of the global sort of, supply chain of protein. This shows Brazil and the USA being massive growers of soybean, and China being a huge consumer of soybean product, but also other countries around the world. And China uses it to feed pigs and poultry and other things like that. Again, these kind of reports are available on our website. And it has a lot of impacts on the producing countries in terms of deforestation and links to potential emergence of disease as people get closer to the forest and various kinds of animals living in the forest. Next slide, please. And this just shows over time the rise in the consumption of global soybean around the world, with a heavy dominance of China over the last few years, which increases food security in China greatly. And other countries are also using soybeans for a variety of different purposes, including in the West. So next slide, please. That was just an example of the kind of work we're doing on one of the kind of trades and how it links to chickens and food security. Wildlife trade is a global business. I mean, billions of dollars a year are consumed in trading wildlife around the world, but do we know which species are being traded and from where to where? Increasingly the answer is yes. So next slide, please. So we're overall building a tool that can show all the different trades of wildlife around the world. We have, I think it's 20 million records in the CITES trade database, so that's legally traded species. So very soon there'll be a web portal where you can look at where is all the parrots or pangolins or other kinds of species being traded to and from. But we've recently done some work with the UK Joint Nature Conservation Committee on what of those species are linked to the emergence of pandemics. So again, there's a link on the bottom of this slide showing which countries are exporting, which countries are importing, and what kinds of species are linked to emergence of diseases. So with that kind of work, I think it's quite helpful for the One Health agenda. Next slide, please. And this just shows some of the kinds of trades that are going on in species that may carry diseases, and a lot of trade in parrots and other kinds of birds, as you can see on here. Again, the chicken link here is some of these species carry the same diseases that can affect global chickens populations and cause catastrophic kind of impacts on chickens and food security through this kind of wildlife trade route. So with lots of information on this kind of thing in the kind of work that we're doing. Next slide, please. And a third section of work that we're doing that gets more down to the ground eventually as we're looking at wild meat trade. So what do people kind of collect from the forest or the wild areas and then mostly eat in even in the village or in towns? Do we know about that? And so next slide, please. We have a lot of people working on this. I mean, the Trade and Environment Hub is only a minor partner. This outlines a whole panoply of different areas of work going on databasing up wild meat trade, sustainable wildlife management sort of work, urban bushmeat project in Congo. So lots of partners. Mostly this is not really the Trade Hub work, but I'm just going to present some of this as an indication of the kind of work going on. Next slide, please. For example, gathering all the data that we know about wild meat trade is happening through this database being produced by different partners. So, from the field and into a database and to provide insights. So next slide, please. Goes involving use of smartphones and smart technology out in the field and feeding data into a database. Next slide, please. Collecting the localities where wild meat is being harvested and where it's being traded and how that trade of wild meat is happening. Next slide, please. And just an example of, what is known in this database about pangolins, and then which are one of the potential sources of pandemics, or at least some of the diseases are linked back to pangolins, and pangolins are traded to the Far East, for example, and it has been said that they could be one of the hosts of COVID-19, although I think the latest information is that they're probably not. But then we know at least something about the trade in pangolins and where they're coming from. So, and that links to sort of food security as well, because people are eating the pangolins in Africa. Next slide, please, and elsewhere. And finally, then, so if we know that there's a large amount of wild meat trade going on, and it can link to both disease transmission and it can link to food security issues, are there ways to understand that trade in a great deal of detail? So this is a piece of work mostly being done by the Wildlife Conservation Society, looking at the detail of how does wild meat trade work in the Congo countries, Republic of Congo and Democratic Republic of Congo. Where does it come from? How does it get transported, and where does it end up? And for the next slide, please. It ends up in restaurants, often a lot of it, for example, here, and there's an attempt being made now within the Democratic Republic of Congo to celebrate, local cuisine that doesn't involve wild meat collected from the forest, so reducing the disease transmission risk from that meat, but also increasingly how does domesticated meat fill the gap in the demand. So again, a strong link here to how can you have chickens in either local areas or chicken farms or some other kind of farmed meat that can replace the wild meat supply in a safer way in terms of the sanitary conditions of the meat being produced, reduce the amount of disease potential transmission from the food that people are eating into the people, and therefore possibly around the world, as we've seen. So quite a lot of work now happening on demand reduction campaigns launched by the government in DR Congo, run by them, supported by others, but it's really a national kind of campaign that's going on in DR Congo at the moment. So that was my kind of presentation, which was really just to give you a flavor of the kind of work that the GCRF Trade Hub is doing. And hopefully that gives you some idea of what we're up to, and you might ask us some questions about how does that link to the theme of the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Neil. That was a great introductory session on the intricacies of wildlife trade. I've had one question come in while you've been presenting, and this is Eliza Smith of Kaima Foundation, and it touches on your last couple of slides. And she's wondering about the reliance of rural and urban people in Africa on wild meat. And so this is beyond Congo. I guess you've outlined one of the programs in Congo, but do you know if there's much interest beyond the Congo basin?
Oh yes, I mean, definitely. So I've worked a lot in Tanzania and in East Africa, and for sure there's rural populations and also town populations eating wild meat, everything from very small species up to giraffes and elephants and things like that. So there's elephant meat in the diet of people in Tanzania quite frequently from village the surveys. Some of this is organized trade, some of it's informal trade, but there's a slight difference in my mind between Central Africa and Eastern and Southern Africa. In the towns, at least, there are now large chicken farms, for example, that are replacing the demand for meat with chickens which are being produced locally. So it isn't only wild meat being consumed, whereas sometimes I think in the Congo countries it has been pretty much only wild meat being consumed. So that's a difference in the way that things have evolved in the food systems in those parts of the world.
Thanks very much, Neil. That's great. Well, I think we have the results of the first poll coming in. If we could just call those up, we can have a quick look. Very interesting that almost 2/3 of us think that no matter what we eat, we should be sure that it is safe, nutritious, and promotes sustainability. And there's also around 1/3 of us who think it's really important to prioritize locally produced food that's good for us and good for our planet. Thanks very much for that. And now I'm delighted to move on to invite Dr. Sagari Ramdas to deliver her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Robyn. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm really happy to be here and be with everyone today. So I hope to be able to talk today about basically, just a second, I'm just going to be, all right. I have a little problem with my, okay, here we go, right. I hope everybody can see the screen, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm hoping to focus today through the lens of poultry, looking at the food systems, local, regional, and global. Now, the pandemic has really been a moment for all of us to bring focus to the vulnerabilities of a global food regime, which is largely controlled today by agribusiness corporations, which are really anchored around global supply chains, which are just becoming longer and longer. For instance, here is a diagram of the city where I stay in Hyderabad, where not only were the supply chains broken between outstanding rural areas where there were farmers who were bringing in milk or meat or eggs, but that was just a small proportion. What was really worrying was in the rural areas, and here you can see the diagram over here in the villages, it was the food supply chain breakdown within the villages amongst the food producers. Because what has happened in today's food regime is that the food producer is no longer producing primarily food to feed themselves, but producing a commodity. So in this case, it could be eggs, it could be maize, it could be cotton, it could be soya. And you then sell that, and in turn you buy your food. And so the largest proportion of food insecurity experienced has been in the rural areas amongst the food producers, because then you have food which is going out, being processed and coming back into the smallest and most remotest area. And this really has been what the pandemic has done, is to magnify the intent and the extent of the vulnerability of the system. And when we look at the case of poultry, for instance, we found that, for instance, COVID, there was this fear amongst a lot of people that if you consume meat and chicken, it is going to enhance your vulnerability to COVID. And therefore, it resulted in this massive kind of cascading impact. There was a fear, there was a sudden drop in consumption, not to mention the fact that the closure of hotels, restaurants, and all the other entertainment business, which today has really become a huge consumer of, for instance, industrial poultry or poultry. There was this huge fall in demand, a fall in crash in prices, and then in turn, this fall in the impact experienced by the small producer, who is today, of course, vertically integrated and contracted into largely an industrial system. So there was livelihood loss, there was culling of birds, both by broiler producers, layer producers, and a massive loss. And of course, this loss is experienced at the end of the day by the small producer who today is producing the poultry. And when we look in India, the system, and why I talk about the lack of the resilience, the absence of resilience, and the huge vulnerability, the system today, for instance, in India and largely around the world, is 80% industrial, 20% backyard poultry. The 80% industrial is largely today vertically integrated companies, a monopoly of very few companies. In India, there are about 5 or 6 companies today controlling this entire 80%. And from farm to plate, it's literally the entire conglomerate is controlled by this system. And on the other side, we have this backyard poultry system, which we in the Alliance, and I forgot to mention that the Food Sovereignty Alliance, we talk about food sovereignty, which is the control by people. We in the Alliance are an alliance of small producers, marginal small farmers, pastoralists, and non-food producer consumers. And for instance, here you find that in backyard poultry, we are talking about the control over the breed, over the feed, over the health, over the medicines, over how you actually, over the markets. And the vulnerability of the industrial system today, and what I want to bring focus to, take breed, for instance. You have two large conglomerates. There's the Eric West-Johann group, there's Hendrix Genetics, which literally control the genetics of poultry across the globe. So despite in India, poultry being sold and by brand names or by other companies, ultimately you can trace the genetics all the way down to the vertically contracted in poultry farmer to these large two conglomerates. And when we have a system which is ecologically so diverse with climate change over there and today's situations like pandemics, being completely dependent, a system dependent on your breed, which is the genetics, just on two massive global conglomerates, just speaks for the vulnerability of the system. And therefore in India, the pandemic was quickly followed by, for instance, bird flu, which broke out, yes, of course, amongst poultry, broiler chicken rearers, but who were vertically integrated into these larger, big systems. Take the situation of feed. 70% of feed today is ultimately the cost of what is going in to produce that broiler chicken. And when you look at the vulnerabilities at the back end and the forward linkages, at the back end, you have a huge number of small farmers, marginal farmers who are growing maize, but 80% of that maize today is going into the animal feed industry, of which nearly 55% in India is consumed by poultry. So when the system collapses, you find that those small farmers who are producing this maize, their livelihoods also got completely crushed, and in turn their food intake. And therefore, this kind of commodity system where the entire system just collapses, either because of a pandemic or a climatic change or a disease system, is something which once again brings focus to the entire vulnerabilities of this global system. Finally, this system has not met the needs of food inequality in terms of the inequity of food consumption, be it in milk, where today India is #1 in global milk production, but we still have 14 times more milk being consumed by the richest in this country, or the fact that we may be #1, we may be topmost producers in chicken and egg, but the wealthiest 5% consume 24 times more egg and meat as a bottom 5%. The question is that this system, this huge industrial system, has not even met the needs of nutrition, nor has it met the needs of actually being able to meet the diversity of cultures of poultry and food consumption. On the other hand, you find here that in the backyard poultry system, I spoke about breeds, which are very diverse. And of course, today, even the breeds are trying to be encompassed and controlled by the big poultry companies who are now trying to supply backyard poultry rearers with their own backyard poultry breeds. But if you look at backyard poultry systems, it's not just the breed, but the means of exchange, the means of markets, where the poultry is just one amongst several forms of livelihood, which you do. You grow your grain, you grow your pulses, you grow goats, you keep sheep, you may keep some backyard poultry, but that it is to then you supply your own food, and then you meet your own income needs by selling whatever you need when you want to. But when we look at the response of the state and the response of the governments in such a pandemic situation, it is just deepening and propping up and investing more and more to prop up a system which this pandemic has exposed to be so vulnerable. So we are propping up a system with huge investment. If you take the example of India, we have this massive big infrastructure fund to further invest to support private companies in processing, in cold storage. And of course, you find that it is for the benefit of not only the companies which are situated within your state and within your country, but globally as well, the national and multinational agribusiness. For instance, the response of the Netherlands government to the announcement of India has been that this provides an opportunity, that the pandemic provides an opportunity for a new investment, for making new profits. And if we look at the entire pandemic, in fact, it's been the global food chains who have not, and the agribusiness, who have continued to make profits while millions have been pushed into starvation and livelihood insecurity and lost and into more and more malnourishment. So you find that these funds are all about intensifying, further integrating, further expanding the global supply chains. And this is all with an intent not to address your own inequities of food availability of food consumption and protein and malnourishment, but about exports. And the advantages which people hope to gain through that is selling more of their produce and products. And even in backyard poultry, the remaining kind of elements where you have resilience, which is local, the whole plan is that you integrate them into companies, integrator companies, and those will then be sold further. So these niche markets, you're talking about niche markets, you're talking about elite markets and products, and thereby actually alienating people from their own cultures of food consumption based on those local poultry, because it's all about then converting it into a commodity. But what we argue is that by investing more and more, by these huge capital investments into a system which is already, it's virtually demonstrating itself through this pandemic to be completely vulnerable. We can't invest, it has to be dismantled. We here in the Alliance are talking about a system which is about collective control, where people organize themselves, community organize themselves to control their breed. They decide which breeds they will rear, how they will rear it. They control their labor, the capital, and multiple marketing avenues, be it to local markets, be it exchange between themselves, be it about storage and processing, be it about selling and selling it to whoever you choose to sell it to, and when you choose to sell it to. Because the plan today is that you organize yourself as communities, but only act as an aggregator of produce to then supply and then get further integrated into global supply chains. And that, my friends, we cannot see a future which is resilient, which is democratic, which is just, which is ecologically going to be completely, sustainable, unless you really rework the system. And you're talking about food webs, you're talking about food sovereignty, and no longer about commodity supplies. Thank you very much. I'm going to end there.
Thanks so much. That was an excellent presentation and really highlights some of the issues linking production systems with utilization of resources. It's great to see questions coming in. We have one question here for you, Sagari, coming in from Dr. Islam in Bangladesh. He would like you to expand on what such a localized food system looks like in practice.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Robyn. Thank you, Dr. Islam, for your question. I think that the local food system is really about the diversity. So when we talk about a local food system, it's not privileging just protein from poultry or protein from milk or protein from eggs. It's about really looking at the ecology, the diversity. It's about looking at, you have multiple sources of protein and how these could then be locally produced, locally consumed, and you build your circles outwards. And it's not about you in a village providing your food primarily to an outside supply chain, who then comes back and supply you food. So we're really talking about reworking the system, where you are really looking very closely about the fact that protein itself can be met through diverse sources, and building your systems circularly and cyclically, rather than these chains, which today, the chains are just getting longer and longer, and our carbon footprints are getting longer and longer. I think I will end. There's more we can discuss about it, but I'd like to end there. Yeah.
Thanks so much. As I say, lovely to see these questions coming in. Neil, there's one here from you, from Dr. Rashid Muhammad in Bangladesh also. He's keen to know, do we know which species in trade might be the source of potential future pandemics? And do we have an understanding of their global trade patterns?
Yes, so I skipped over it quite quickly, but there's one of the reports on the presentation I've just made is just out like last month, and it's with the Joint Nature Conservation Committee of the UK, but also UNEP-WCMC. We've looked at all the species in legal trade, so all the CITES regulated species, and then matched those to the kinds of species that are known to carry different kinds of diseases, and then looked at the trade flow patterns around the world for those kinds of species. So it's quite a rich report full of lots of different graphs and data and things. I just showed a couple of snippets from it, but it's linked in the presentation. So if the presentation is circulated, you can pull out the hyperlink and then go and read the report, and even come back to us here, but also colleagues at UKJNCC for further information. So it's not perfect, and it is only legal trade, and it is only international trade. So it's not the national trade and it's not the illegal trade, but it's a good shot at the system and how does it work and where the risks might be.
Thanks so much, Neil. And yes, your presentation, the whole 1 hour panel will be posted on the Poultry Hub website, and each of your individual 10-minute presentations will also be posted for those who are time poor. They can just take 10-minute grabs. Sagari, we have a wonderful question for you here. Dr. Sattar, also from Bangladesh, strong representation from Bangladesh today. Dr. Sattar is asking, how can the nutritional/protein needs be met by local backyard poultry breeds, which have such low productivity and yields?
Thank you, Dr. Sattar. And what I would, again, I think it links a bit to my previous response, that protein is something that we derive from multiple sources. So to merely locate protein only coming and being derived from backyard poultry, I think this is the kind of, very unidimensional scientific thinking, which seems to characterize the way we look at protein or animal sources of protein today. So when a farmer or a small, indigenous, it's usually women who are rearing their backyard poultry, you have the poultry there as one source of your protein, and you meet your other sources of protein from many other diverse means. So it could be from your pulses, it could be from milk, it could be from the fact that you consume fish, it could be from goat meat. So you have, I think that we have a restructuring here, a relocating how we view protein and productivity itself. So when you only look at productivity, locating it only within a bird, and then you find that it's the multiplicity or the multifunctionality of that system, which I think we need to be re-looking at. So it's not just focusing on a mode of looking at the productivity of an animal in relation to how much of meat it produces or how much of eggs it produces. So that is my response to you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Hopefully some of these conversations can continue on.
Is it possible to chip in
after today's panel?
Can I?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
I mean, it's interesting that, so in the situation in India and many other parts of the world, of course, the wild sourced protein is perhaps not a very major source of food security in India, but in rural Africa, especially in the Congo, but also elsewhere, one of their diverse sources of protein is hunting in the forest or around the farms, and all kinds of species there. So at that sort of situation, what we're aiming to do is to replace the hunting of wild animals with more domesticated sources, and then it starts to go into the the early part of the system, perhaps that you're describing, the village level, and then into the industrial level, and then finally into the export level. But there's a sort of progression from getting your protein entirely from the wild through to getting your protein like we do in the UK now, I suppose, from global supply chains, and the meat could be coming from pretty much anywhere. So there's an interesting kind of like, progression all the way through. And I just wondered if you had any comments on that in the context of India.
Would you like me, should I respond to that, Robyn? Is that okay? Yes.
Please do.
So the thing in India is that we have very strict, actually we have strict laws and legislations forbidding any form of consumption of wildlife meat. So that would be one of the major reasons why wildlife meat is actually, it is criminalized, right? It is illegal to be consuming wildlife meat. So wildlife meat cannot be legally consumed in India. What is happening today is that you have situations like certain kinds of farms which are growing, for instance, we have some farms growing ostrich, some farms, which are being, so these are, but we don't have any farmed, neither do we have farmed wildlife, sources of wildlife meat. And of course, as I said, it's completely illegal to consume wildlife meat. So the thing over here is, I would argue that in the Indian context, when you do have had, you have a large proportion of farmers, you still have about 65% of our citizens and population who are farming communities. There's a very strong opportunity for farming communities, for farming to be so diverse, which it was till about 30 years ago. And the diversity of farming generating a whole bowl of a diverse, different kinds of foods and culturally appropriate kinds of foods, be it animal-based or plant-based, and these then, building up from the rural to wider chains, to wider webs, and then actually feeding in your urban areas. But instead today, you have had a policy which has actually pushed a system where a farmer has today become, in a way, enslaved and their entire livelihood tied to producing just one commodity, because it is about, when the global food supply chain, they want a commodity. And I think I think that is here the issue at this moment, that there's an opportunity in this pandemic to really understand that the global food supply chains have been so vulnerable. And I think the one who's facing the vulnerability at the maximally is the producer, and of course, the most impoverished. So coming to the wildlife issue, there is no, at this moment, wildlife replacing any form of meat is definitely out of the question. But looking at protein itself, we need to look at all the different diversity of protein available, the cultural appropriateness, but also rework, I would say, the systems in which you are producing, the distribution, the exchange, and the consumption. Yeah, that's my response. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to go back and follow the voting here. Ton, I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name. You have a question for Professor Burgess. He says, you refer to the percentage of people involved in wildlife trade that have had a zoonotic disease. Can you elaborate on that and how you got that detail of information?
I'm not, was that on one of the slides? I'm not sure I have an answer to that one in terms of an absolute percentage. I mean, it was the percentage of I thought, species that have a potential to provide or carry diseases, rather than the number of people or percentage of people that have got diseases from wildlife trade. But maybe I've misunderstood. I'm sorry, I don't think I can answer that one.
That's anyway, it suggests that what you had intended to say was about the proportion or the percentage of wildlife that had been associated with the transmission, or had the potential to transmit.
Exactly. So that's what I was meaning. So of the species that are in trade, which ones are potentially carriers of different kinds of diseases. And this is not only COVID type diseases, it's also anthrax and many kinds of diseases that are carried by wildlife and domestic animals as well, and which of those are in trade and from where to where. So if it's parrots, for example, there's a global trade in parrots and they can carry avian flu. So if you're trading parrots from Brazil to the Middle East, which is a fairly big trade, you can end up carrying avian flu or other kind of avian diseases into the chicken population or other bird population in a different part of the world, that then has these knock-on kind of effects, and which Sagari's talked about, you know, potentially wiping out the chicken industry somewhere, but caused by a wildlife trade rather than local issues. That's, I think, what I was trying to say.
Lovely, thanks, Neil. Sagari, we have a lovely point here from Prakash Kuringa. Prakash is asking, cooperative structures like AMUL, AMUL, which he says is for milk procurement and distribution, could this help the poultry industry? Could a structure like this help the poultry industry in India?
Thank you, Prakash, for your question. You know, the cooperative sector has changed hugely in India since pre-liberalization and economic reforms in India and today. So the cooperative, which is AMUL, which earlier, I would say pre-liberalization, really was about local producers getting organized, and then you meet your need locally, right? The real intent was local. Today, it is really transformed. AMUL is very much an agribusiness their interests are driven by actually expanding their markets to sell their produce. And I would say that that is exactly the systems which are destroying then other local producers for their local kinds of production, wherever they may be. For instance, if AMUL today is selling and views Bangladesh or views Nepal as a potential market to sell their milk, it really then challenges local milk producers in Nepal or Bangladesh. And we are very concerned about that from the Food Sovereignty Alliance, because we have experienced how this kind of cooperatives, and this story is really there across the global north. I mean, we've just followed that pattern. In the global north, one of the largest I would say in Germany or Netherlands, or even if you look at the top dairies in the world, some of the largest companies in the world are so-called cooperatives. So it's not just the cooperative structures which can address the questions I've been raising about in the poultry sector. I would say that when you cooperatize, when you collectivize, communities come together and collectivize themselves or organize themselves. It is about organizing yourself, and there are examples of members in our alliance, even in poultry and in milk, who are organizing themselves with a particular one of their produce. It could be milk, in example, if in one of the indigenous areas or Adivasi areas, it is poultry. But they are very, very clear that their level of organizing and their markets of that are organized so that it is not about just having this intent that you want to conquer the world. You want to conquer the geographies of food consumption. But it's about really being very, very, very realistic as to what you produce in relation to your resources, in relation to your ecologies, and then to what extent, to what limits then do you market that? Because there are so many producers still in the global south, right? So we can have, that's why I spoke about webs. There are webs where you organize, you collectivize, you can sell your produce, but then you keep your limit. Is it 20 kilometers? Is it 30 kilometers? Is it 50 kilometers? You don't need to be an AMUL or a I don't know, a Danone or whichever company or cooperative today globally to be selling your milk across the world. And I think that is the problem that we face today. So no, I don't think the way in which AMUL exists today, the way in which the cooperatives have structured themselves today to just mimic and be one amongst the global food supply, part of this global food supply chain is going to be the solution to the problem. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks so much, Sagari. And I noticed that we've had two comments here from Dr. Antonio Rota of IFAD. He congratulates you on raising these issues related to the different poultry production systems. And for those of you watching, if you go down in the Q&A section, he's also sent through a link which has a case study for the work that they're doing with village chickens in Cambodia. So I think you're getting a lot of questions, Sagari. We're not going to get through them all today, but you clearly started a conversation that's really, really interesting a lot of people. So Neil, I'm going to come to one for you, and this is coming from Dr. Islam. And he's saying, oh, oops, it's just jumped. I'm not using the system well. If we compare two sources of meat, bush meat and the meat which is permissible for human beings, that produced in domestic animals, which source of food should be emphasized for nursing or nourishing to secure human health?
That's quite a complicated question with multiple aspects to it. I mean, the wild meat captured in the forest and consumed locally is theoretically safe and nutritious, and definitely people enjoy eating it in many parts of the world for cultural reasons and nutrition reasons. But there are pathogens associated, diseases associated with some of the species that are collected from wild areas, and poor kind of harvesting or poor hunting practices can also enhance the possibility of those disease transfers happening. So the risks of disease transfer from wild species to humans is a lot higher. I can't give you a percentage, but a lot higher from wild collected or wild hunted species, and it's especially high from some of the kinds of species that are known to carry diseases of people. So primates, for example, others as well, rats, rodents. So there is a heightened risk to human health from hunting and eating those kind of species. If you have chickens in a well-maintained facility, either in the village or in a factory, the risk of disease transfer to humans is a lot lower. So, you know, the meat might be, I don't know, we could argue slightly less good quality if it's from an industrial facility, but it's potentially or highly likely to be safer than some species that people are eating from the forest. So there's plenty of examples of disease transfer from wild species to people in Africa in particular, but not only Africa, China, for example.
Thanks, Neil. And I will note that some public health nutritionists do say that they think that the meat of wild animals or more traditional breeds, it's a leaner meat and it tends to be more nutritionally dense. So there are, and that's the type of meat that we did evolve with over the centuries, over the thousands of years. Another question here for Sagari, and this is a question from Shamada Nagarajan, and I've mispronounced that. Please help me, Sagari, when you're responding to pronounce that correctly. Asking, how do you view the role of local governments in reconfiguring the local food systems, especially in rural areas? Do state, national food and agricultural policies provide the necessary flexibility in their frameworks to support this transition?
Thank you, Sharmada, for your question. I would say that, you know, states and national food policy regime, I mean, agriculture policies play a very important role in this. So just to cite an example from India, and, you know, we have, our government recently brought in legislations. These are evoked huge resistance from the farmers in India, These are 3 farm laws, and I will not go into the details of it. But essentially, the legislations have only further enabled and enhanced the opportunities of the global supply chains taking over the food system. And for the food, for existing systems of even whatever limited kind of localized systems of food to get further kind of captured by global food systems. So in such a, and if you look at all the kinds of investments and the money available and the budgets allocated, all of them are just, for instance, leading to, based on a framework, which is about local communities just being an aggregator for commodity produce, which can then get into this, be integrated into the supply chain. Therefore, if state and central governments, which are ultimately accountable to their people because we have elected them in, we are a democratic country still, at the end of the day, it is therefore really relooking at what it is, given climate change, given energy crisis, given today disease crisis, pandemic crisis, given all these crises, given livelihood crisis, can we really then relook at how can states and centers reallocate their budgets and their resources to really invest and support the kind of restructuring of the system? And of course, it can't happen overnight. You will have to then work it through gradually, you know, step by step. But if there is no intent, then there is no policy backing with finances and other kinds of legislations. So that is my response to you. Yes.
Sagari, I'm just having a look here, and this is a question to both of you, and you're both going to have a maximum of 2 minutes because our time is getting short. Marcelo de Maria is asking, how important is it to look at linkages between animal supply chains and other agricultural commodities? And both Sagari and Neil, you both touched on this point. Marcelo is asking, can we address sustainability and health and safety concerns one commodity/supply chain at a time, or do we need a more holistic approach? So over to both of you. Thank you.
Do you want to go first, Sagari?
Maybe you want to speak because I just had the last question.
Okay.
Yes.
I mean, as I was alluding to in my talk, I mean, these things are linked together. So the global soybean production system, for example, is strongly linked to the industrial meat production systems and national meat production systems. So you can't, I think, separate the production of grain, corn, or soybeans or other commodities that are fed to animals from the meat production system, and the agricultural system itself encroaches into natural habitats and has this potential to expose people to areas that might have more disease. So there is a disease risk, there's a loss of biodiversity risk, and there's a marginalization of people when agriculture becomes industrial, which it does. So people are pushed out of their lands as well. So the industrial system to create the grain has a variety of impacts, and then that grain, it goes into the industrial system producing meat, and then it has the kind of impacts I think that Sagari is talking about as well. So they are highly linked together. Can you separate them from commodity by commodity to that entire system? Maybe, but that's quite a big ask. Even to do it for soybean is a big ask, obviously. So I'm going to pass on to Sagari and dodge that bit.
Thank you for the question. I really don't believe that this can be addressed as a commodity on commodity basis. It has to be addressed within a system, but also it has to be addressed very localized. That means you have to be looking at these questions I feel if I speak, it's going to be a repetition of everything I've said thus far, but really you cannot, this is not about looking at a commodity and, tinkering with how do we, and if you look at the responses right now, everywhere, industry is pushing for that, right? Industry is pushing for tinkering with each commodity, but the commodities are linked. As in my presentation, I very clearly showed, there's poultry and there's maize. And you have farmers today who are growing a commodity, which is maize, and there are farmers today who've been integrated to grow a commodity, poultry. So we really have to be re-looking at this structure through which our food is being produced. It's not about having a solution like what the other solution being proposed today, having artificial meat and artificial poultry and I don't know what, but it is about the system and who is controlling the system, who is making the decisions. And until those decisions, that relocalization and the decentralization is in place, we cannot, and therefore you are looking at it holistically. You cannot be looking at it as piecemeal, because that's what everything has led to where we are today, looking at everything as silos. Yeah, thank you.
Fabulous. Such a rich discussion. I'm really sorry that we have to draw this short hour to a close, but I do hope that this important discussion will continue. I'd like you to join with me to thank our two panelists, and if we could have the key, lovely, the key messages coming through. So global supply chains in agricultural products and wildlife have largely negative impacts on nature, except where sustainable use is practiced by local communities. That's an important point. The global wildlife trade includes species groups that are known vectors of pathogen groups linked to human diseases, and wildlife consumption could be replaced by domestic animals. When we look at the global food regime, it contributes to protein deficiencies, malnutrition, and alienation of communities, and it does need to be dismantled. And it's interesting, you've used the term dismantled, Sagari. The FAO is talking about transformation of food systems, so hopefully we're all thinking along the same lines. The ongoing pandemic has served to magnify and uncover the vulnerability of this food system and the challenges and vulnerabilities promoted by longer and longer global supply chains. Sagari has argued that we need an authentic, sovereign, democratic, just, and ecologically resilient food farming system that's grounded on principles of solidarity and reciprocity, with ownership over the means of production and decision-making in the hands of smallholder food producers. So for you and our audience, this is your time. What do you think? Our final poll question for today should just be coming up. And we're asking you that to achieve sustainable food and nutrition systems, it is most important to choose the option that is most important to you. And we'll have a quick look before we finish up. So thanks again, really, to Sagari and to Neil. You've been excellent. Thanks to the tech team working in the background to make everything run smoothly, and to you, our audience, for your interest and wonderful range of questions that have come through. Do please, if you can, engage with this discussion on Slack. We have some papers waiting for you already. The questions that were unanswered will be there. And as will the key questions. So if we could now have a look, do we have answers for our poll yet? If not, yes, there we are. Very interesting. Most of us are saying that we need to be conscious of where our food comes from and how it interacts with our health and the health of our community. Fabulous, very interesting. Now, if we could have the final slide, we're going to have a 1 month interval before our next panel, which is on the 7th of July. It's going to be another really engaging discussion with Prof. Flora, the former chair of One Health Bangladesh and currently additional director within the Ministry of Health, and Professor Ortwin Wren, the scientific director at the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies. They're going to be looking at food system governance, and that's going to be moderated by Professor Dirk Pfeiffer. He'll be asking, what role can One Health risk governance play in contributing to to food systems. Thanks all for your attention once again. Thanks so much, Sagari and Neil. Really important messages that you've delivered to us today. Please, everyone, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again on the 7th of July. All the best.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks for joining.